What's good everyone, Enrique here with another video, and this time we're talking about the Digitakt and really focusing on the trigger page. Also, a quick side note, just put this line of hats out, so check the link in the description below and I'll see you later, oscillator. Let's get into it. Alright, so the trigger page on the Digitakt. The shortest page on the Digitakt, but can be sometimes the most complicated or confusing. Where it really comes into play is when you start live recording in your sounds. Reason being is because everything is parameter lockable, but it also kind of records in all your movement when you're live playing your sounds. Meaning, I'm going to go ahead and turn on my metronome, right? Press play, and I'm going to go to chromatic mode. And I'm going to try to find some little pattern we can play. Let's see. Okay, simple. Right? So now that we have this recorded in here, I'm going to get out of chromatic and turn off my metronome. So we'll go here, and if I hit record, you can see the two notes that we have recorded in. If I press and hold one of these, you can see that all these values change. But this is where it gets really interesting, because you can then go and change up the way you played your notes initially. But maybe you just want to keep the length, but you want to change the note. So holding this down, you can see I played an A sharp. I can move this down. That's kind of cool, gives a little bit more of a menacing look. So then you also have your conditions over here on the right. There's a ton of conditions. I'm not going to go through all of them, but some of my favorite are the percentages. Right, so a 2% chance that this is going to trigger. Probably won't trigger sometime in this video, but we'll leave it there and see if it actually does. And just to make sure, we'll turn this note really high up. So I'm going to set that to 2%, but I'm going to go ahead and set a couple others. 33% is one of my favorites because it gives it enough of a chance to trigger that it's not too repetitive, but it's also not too random. Another cool thing is you can also hold down a trigger and copy it and paste it around. Right, so now we got this cool little forever changing thing with these two solid ones that are always going to be playing. So your notes represent what notes are on each step. By changing this without parameter locking anything, that's just going to change the default note at what each step you enter in is going to be played at, right? So basically, because these don't have anything parameter locked, I can change their notes as a whole, right? Just by moving this. If they'll ever trigger. There we go. Remember, they're on 33%. So I'm moving all the default ones that I didn't play in live by +7, or moving them all to G3. I'm going to move this back down to 0, or C3, which is basically, center of no pitch up or down. So after your notes, you have velocity, and what velocity is going to do is basically change how hard that note is going to be played, affecting majority of the times the amplitude level or the volume of that sound. After that, of course, you have your length, and what length is going to do is change how long that note was held. This really works really well and in tandem with the amp page. So listening for length when you're doing stuff with hi-hats or kick drums isn't really going to change the way they sound too much as it is when you're going to be using longer samples like chord stabs or bass lines and things like that. And of course, again, it works perfectly in sync with the amp page. So if your amp page settings are set a little funky, you may be moving this and not realizing that it's not really doing much, because your amp page is going to be set to hold note, which means when you hit the note, it's just going to play the whole sample through or not, or you may have some weird things set up. So after that, of course, we have our conditions, which we went through. Basically, you have different types of conditions. So nothing can happen when I move this because I'm not selecting a step to trigger or set a condition on. So I'm going to set one here. If we go through here, we have fill, which you can see here is basically when I press this, let's go to a new pattern, right? So I'm going to take this pattern, and the reason I'm copying the pattern and then going to a new one and pasting it is because I want to keep all those sounds, but I'm going to go ahead and clear the pattern itself. Boom. So we have the sample still. And I'm going to go ahead and put a couple hits in here. So pressing play. Right, I'm going to focus on this one here, and I'm going to set it to fill. And I'm going to copy that and paste it here. I'm also going to paste it here, here, and here, and here. So these two are not set to fill. But if I press page when record is off, it's more of a performance tool. It's allowing me to play the ones that were set to fill. The cool thing here is there's negative fill. So if I go and enable record mode again, hold down this step, and not set it to fill, but set it to fill with the line, that means it's still going to play as long as I don't press fill. So now watch what happens when I press fill. These two are no longer playing. So some other conditional triggers include the pre and the pre-negative. What pre means is basically the previous step. So it's a little confusing, but hear me out. So basically, to demonstrate this, I'm going to set the first trigger to pre. And I'm going to go ahead and turn off all these other triggers. I'm going to set a trigger on 13, but I'm going to set it to fill. So watch this. If I press play, so you can see it plays on the first time, but doesn't play any other times. But since I have this one set to fill, watch what happens when I press fill. That one now plays when this one plays. So what's happening? Basically what PRE means, or pre, is previous. If the previous evaluated trigger or step, in this case this one, happens to be true because it has a condition on it, and the condition was true when I pressed fill, aka triggered, the following thing set to previous, and the previous step to this one happens to be this one. If this is true, this one will play. If this isn't true, this one will not play. Another way to demonstrate this is if I set this to a percentage, let's say 33%. I press play. See? If this doesn't play, that won't play. Doesn't play, that won't play. Plays, plays. So why do this, right? Why not just set both of these to 33%? That's because these would both have to roll the dice and have that 33% chance versus setting both of these to the same trigger condition, so that they can kind of play in tandem with one another. How many times have I said tandem? I feel like I've said it a million times today. So this allows you to kind of get these cool different rhythms within this, and this really starts to come into play when you go through some of the other things like the other percentages or the ratios at the end, or even just like the neighbor tracks and stuff. And again, using it with fill and whatnot is really fun to use. So another conditional trig includes the NEI and NEI negative, which stands for neighbor, and neighbor negative. This one's a little more confusing, as if the other ones weren't already. What this is saying is basically the track before the one I'm currently working on, which is track 8, if there's a evaluated trigger on there that happens to be true, so another one set to a conditional trigger on track 7, let's say this, 33%, right? And I go back to track 8, and this is set to neighbor. This will not play unless the trigger on track 7 is true. So if that 33% chance of it being triggered happens, then this trigger on track 8 will also happen. Again, the dudes at Electron are insane to even think of something like that. So using that to really create a forever evolving pattern is nuts. Like really, really nuts. And same goes for the neighbor negative. If the previously evaluated trigger on track 7 was not true, this will trigger. So say you have some crazy sound that happens here randomly, and if it happens, this trigger here will then not happen. So that's a good way to kind of create, again, another forever evolving kind of changing pattern within the Digitakt sequencer. Also, another awesome conditional trigger that you guys have is at the very end you have these ratios, and what these are basically saying, they're made up of two numbers. And if we set this to 1, 4, basically play on the first round of every 4 pattern cycles. So it'll just kind of keep looping. It's another really cool way of creating a lot of polyrhythms within the Digitakt sequencer. So these really come in handy when it comes to kind of creating longer patterns. For example, if I want a crash to happen once every 8 bars, but I only have 4 bars worth of a sequencer, I would set this to 1, 2, meaning on the first time it goes through all of these 4 bars, it'll trigger that crash. But on the second time it goes through all these 4 bars, it will not. So 8 bars have to go by in order for this to re-trigger. Basically saying, 1, trigger this on the first cycle through the patterns out of every 2. And that's when the counter basically resets. So looking at something like, let's say, 4, 6, on the 4th time the patterns go through the whole entire pattern, play this. But on the 6th time, reset the counter of when this will happen. So after 6, it goes back to 1. And then once it hits 4, it'll then trigger this again. It won't trigger it on 5. It won't trigger it on 6, but then it goes back to 1. You're basically resetting the counter with the second number and saying at what cycle or which number of patterns is the first number is when this trigger will play. So I know that the conditional triggers can be a little daunting and confusing at times, but trust me, put in the time to learn how they really act and react with one another. Set it to a simple bar and just kind of experiment, because once you really start to take advantage of these, you'll really start to elevate a lot of the patterns and creativity of the Digitakt sequencer itself. And again, a lot of these conditional triggers can apply to the MIDI tracks out. So just put in the time, put some practice in there, and you'll really get this, and it'll really, really improve the way you make music with this thing. All right, so the last 2 parameters you have on the trigger page are the filter trigger and the LFO trigger. And what these mean is basically whether or not this trigger, or I guess you can say step, will trigger either the filter or the LFO. And these really come into play when you go into your LFO page and you have your mode set to basically hold or trigger mode, basically re-trigger or half and whatnot. These will then really come into play on the trigger page because you can turn certain steps off. So this one will restart the LFO, but this one won't, for example, if you have your LFO set to re-trigger mode. Or again, your filter page, you can have a bunch of steps in here, but only have the first one trigger the filter envelope. And if you haven't seen the filter video yet, you can go ahead and check that one out right here. But with the trigger page, that's pretty much all there is to it. I really hope I covered it all. If there's any questions or anything you may still be a little confused on, leave it down in the comments below and I'll get to it as soon as I can. If you guys enjoyed this video, really appreciate the thumbs up. If you didn't enjoy this video, give me a thumbs down and let me know in the comments how I can make these videos better for you guys to enjoy. With all that being said, you guys can always follow me on my Instagram where I post a lot of other videos like this, a little bit more jam versus tutorial, and there may be a piece of gear in my studio that you want to see a video on, so hit me up on there and let me know about it. But with all that aside, you guys know the drill, and that's to share the love, share the knowledge. Knowledge is power. Peace.